Say bye-bye.
Hey everybody, Deathblade here with another Chinese fantasy novel FAQ. Before getting into the video, I want to say yet again, my channel is still demonetized thanks to a really annoying billing address issue. So this video is going to be a sponsored one, sponsored by my upcoming novel, The Heretic Peacekeeper. Depending on when you're watching this video, it might be on pre-order or it might have already been released. It's coming out in ebook, in paperback, also in hardback eventually at some point, and there is going to be an audiobook version eventually as well. I will post the details about that on my Twitter or on the community section of YouTube or wherever you get information from me. This novel is a cyberpunk cultivation novel. It is set in a dystopian future, a giant city run by a corporation. The cultivators are underground, being hunted by the police, and the main character is a homicide detective, an ordinary guy who wants to fight for justice. He goes on a case that drags him into the cultivation world, and he starts to question everything that he understands about reality. So, if it sounds interesting to you, please order or pre-order by checking the description box or the pinned comment below. So now let's get into this topic, which is Wuxia. Is it fantasy? Now, I talk about a couple of different genres primarily on this channel: xianxia, xianxia, Wuxia, and also cultivation. I use cultivation because there are different subgenres, or you could just say genres, whatever word you want to use, that involve cultivation. So this video though is going to be specifically talking about Wuxia. Obviously xuanhuan and xianxia are fantasy. They very overtly involve magic and pretty much high fantasy, I think, in my opinion. I think a lot of people share that opinion. But Wuxia is a different story, and over the years I have engaged in discussions, or maybe you would call them debates, definitely not arguments, because I don't argue with people. But in any case, I've engaged in discussions about whether Wuxia should be categorized as fantasy. There are definitely people out there who think that it should not. Now, before I get into my opinion, I want to point out it is just an opinion, and everybody else is entitled to their opinion as well. I don't think that I am right and everybody else that disagrees with me is wrong, but I do have some opinions on it that I have thought a lot about, and I'm going to share them with you today. Obviously, I started out by saying welcome to a Chinese fantasy novel FAQ, so the mere fact that I put fantasy into that kind of answers a question about what I think. I have done a lot of videos in this Chinese fantasy novel FAQ series talking about Wuxia specifically, or Wuxia elements, in addition to the other genres that I talk about. The other day on Twitter, I saw somebody talking about this. For those of you that don't know, I do kind of lurk in the shadows of Twitter, and every day, generally speaking, but not necessarily as a rule, I kind of go onto Twitter and I check what people are talking about when it comes to the genres that I talk about on this channel. So Wuxia, xianxia, xianhuan, stuff like that. I search for it on Twitter and by the most popular tweets or by the most recent tweets to just kind of see what people are chattering about and see what's going on. A few days ago, I noticed somebody had a big tweet thread, kind of I would call it a rant, but you know, whatever, talking about why Wuxia is not fantasy. And specifically, it is historical fiction. Now, I don't want to get into a whole thing about what is historical fiction, but I think that calling Wuxia historical fiction is not really correct, in my opinion, if you're talking about the whole genre. There are some Wuxia works which absolutely are historical fiction. Now, forgetting about whatever definition you're going to go with historical fiction, let me just say, when I think of historical fiction, I think of stories that are set in a specific time period that generally are going to relate to some specific events in a specific time period and may or may not have characters or at least references to real historical figures, or at least some of those elements. And yes, again, there are Wuxia stories that are very much like that. The whole Condor Heroes trilogy, which I think is probably one of the most famous of Jin Yong's works, takes place in a very specific time period. There are actual historical people in that story, and the events of the story wrap around actual historical events. And of course, many of Jin Yong's works are like that. That said, not all of his works are like that. And of course, he is not the only Wuxia author. There are many other authors out there, and I don't claim to be an expert in all of them. There are people out there who know a lot more about various Wuxia authors than me, but there are many who don't really have many historical elements at all. For example, Gulong, who is one of the other famous ones that I'm more familiar with, has a lot of stories where you have no idea what time period it's set in, and it doesn't have anything to do with history at all. So I think that saying that you have to define Wuxia as being historical fiction is incorrect. That's just my opinion. What's more, just because something is historical fiction does not mean that it cannot be fantasy. There is a thing called historical fantasy fiction. And so, you know, the question to me is not whether Wuxia is historical fiction or fantasy, forget the historical fiction part. The question is it fantasy? Now you will see people arguing that it is not. I'm sure you can go onto Twitter, you can go onto Google, you can search, and you will be able to find people arguing that it is not. And again, I will point out, for however many times I've already said it in this video, this is just my opinion. Here's why I think that Wuxia is fantasy. Now granted, there are a lot of things about Wuxia that are not fantasy. And there are things that fantasy generally has that it doesn't. It doesn't usually have magic. It doesn't have, fantastical creatures. It doesn't have a lot of those things that you basically expect when you go to the science fiction fantasy section and you're going between science fiction fantasy, looking for that fantasy stuff, and what you're looking for in those novels a lot of times is not in Wuxia. That said, the things that happen in Wuxia cannot happen in real life. Now, if you are one of those people who believes that it can, well, we have a lot to talk about. But the ideas that it's based on are real. So traditional Chinese medicine, the meridians in the body, qi energy, actual practice of martial arts, all that stuff is obviously real. But the way that it is applied in Wuxia novels is not. For example, one of the hallmarks of the genre, the lightness arts, the qinggong, whatever you want to call it or translate it as, involves being able to do things that are superhuman in nature. So the people are able to move faster than is possible. They can fly or float. They can do things that are not real. Also, when you read many of the novels, the descriptions of the martial arts that they are practicing have visual elements that are not present in real life, and they are able to do things with their martial arts that you just cannot do. So in my mind, I think it is fantasy. There are examples in Western literature of things that are considered fantasy, which do not have all of the high fantasy elements that you look for in epic fantasy novels. One that has always jumped to mind to me is The Princess Bride, and it doesn't have, wizards and it doesn't have dragons, but it does have little smatterings of the fantastic. And I think that Wuxia actually has a lot more than just mere smatterings of the fantastic. The things that happen in these novels, and of course the movies and television shows, comics and whatever, are just things that don't happen in real life, and they go beyond that which is real. So I don't think it is a stretch at all to call Wuxia fantasy. If you want to go onto Wikipedia, you can research these topics yourself on a very light level, and just go to the fantasy section of Wikipedia where it starts breaking down what are the different subgenres of fantasy, and you're going to find plenty of Western fantasy novels that don't have dragons, that don't have witches and magic spells and different things like that. Those are not the things that necessarily define what fantasy is. Okay, I want to close this out by saying I am a layman. I do not consider myself to be a scholar. I do not consider myself to be a literary critic. I do not consider myself to be an expert in these subjects. I am just a guy. I am a translator who has translated a lot of fiction, and I'm a writer who has written my fair share of stories as well. And I know that this is kind of a polarizing topic where some people have one opinion, some people have another, and it's hard for them to come together and agree. So if you disagree with me on anything I've said in this video, please do not take offense, but you can leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. If you do agree with me, let me know what you think in the comments below. I try to read all the comments. After a certain point, it kind of becomes impossible to check every single comment on every video, but I do check as much as possible. If you like the content on my channel, please do like and subscribe and do all the things that everybody tells you to do in all the YouTube videos. And also make sure to check out The Heretic Peacekeeper, which is coming out March 1st, 2021. So depending on when you're watching this video, it may already be at a later book in the series, or maybe even the whole series has been released. We will see. That's it for now. I will see you next time. Godsala.